Hello everybody. In this course you may have noticed that you are required to submit a weekly voice recording through VoiceThread as a way to practice your speaking skills. You do this by recording yourself speaking in front of a camera, but it's also important to remember that you are doing these presentations for a listener. So you must be able to present in a way that your listeners will be able to understand what you say and follow your ideas, follow the flow of your ideas more clearly. So in this video, I would like to make a suggestion of how to make a more organized oral presentation, particularly for a more formal presentation. And this is a skill that might be useful for you in the future if you have an opportunity to deliver a more formal oral presentation in front of a larger audience. In this video, I'm going to give you 3 easy steps that I hope you can follow for organizing an oral presentation. And I'm also going to give you some examples of how to do this. This video itself will be a demonstration of how to do those 3 steps. So let's begin. The first step is to very simply to make sure that you introduce your topic and your purpose. Introduce what you're going to talk about and why you are going to do this. You can also begin your presentation by giving your listeners an overview of the main parts. This tells them what they can expect after the introduction and allows them to picture in their minds the direction that your presentation is moving towards. You can do this by simply using some simple expressions such as, I am going to tell you about. If you remember at the beginning of this video, I said, I'm going to tell you 3 steps in delivering a better oral presentation. Or you can say something like, I would like to talk about, or I would like to share my opinion about the topic of such and such. Or today, I'm going to tell you about, or in this presentation, I'm going to share an opinion, or my presentation has 2 parts. This is important because, in a way, you are like the driver on a road trip, and your audience are your passengers. So introducing your topic is telling your audience, this is where we are going, and this is the way we are going to get there. Introducing the topic, the purpose, and the main parts helps your audience to see where they're headed, and it helps them to follow your ideas more clearly from this point on. The next step is to present the different parts of your presentation and to present them in the best possible order. You can decide what this best order is. For example, in your voice threads, very often you are given questions to answer. The questions may or may not be in the best order of the presentation. So you can begin by preparing your answers to those questions, and then once you have your notes ready, you can decide to reorder your response according to how you think is the best way to do that. So you may or may not follow the order of the questions on the voice thread. It's up to you to decide the best order to present your ideas. Now, usually, 3 main parts is the best. Audience members, listeners can more easily remember 3 parts or 2 parts, but more than 3 might be a little bit more challenging for them. So try to keep the parts of your presentation into no more than 3 parts. And be sure that you explain each part. When you respond to a question, it's important not simply to give your response, but also to explain why you think this way, to give examples, to give more details for each main part. Let me give you an example. Let's say I'm going to give you a presentation and the topic is on homelessness. So I might begin by saying, I would like to tell you about the topic of homelessness, and I would like to share with you 2 things. I'd like to share with you the first impressions I had about people experiencing homelessness, and secondly, I would like to be able to share how I changed my impression of people experiencing homelessness. First, I thought that people experiencing homelessness were people to be afraid of. I would see them on the street looking unattractive, looking drunk, and maybe even looking dangerous. So I thought of them as criminals. I thought that they were people to be avoided. When I'm walking on the sidewalk, I might perhaps avoid them by going a different direction. This was my first impression of people experiencing homelessness. However, I would like to tell you how I changed this impression. I read articles about people experiencing homelessness, and I read a book called The Way It Works, in which a character, Walter Davis, experienced the same situation. And I learned that each people experiencing homelessness might have a different personal story that explains why they ended up on the streets. Perhaps they had experienced an illness, perhaps they had experienced financial trouble, or perhaps they're experiencing depression. So learning about these specific stories made me realize that it's not right to simply think of people experiencing homelessness in one way. It's important to see them as human beings and not draw only one picture about them as dangerous or as criminals or as drunks. So that was how I changed my impression of them. So did you see how I used two main parts in that presentation, and I gave examples from my personal experience, from my observations. This is the heart of your presentation, the examples, the details, the stories. So take the time to do that, to explain your response to your listeners. As well, it's also important to introduce each of the main parts by telling your listeners, in this first part, this is what I'm going to do. And when you move on to the next part, you might say, now that I've given you this part, now that I've given you my first impressions, I'd like to move on to tell you how I changed that impression. I'd like to move on to the next part. And if there's a final part, you might say, now finally, I'm going to tell you about this last point. So present the main presentation with enough explanations and details in the best order, introducing each main part. The final step in delivering an organized presentation is to make sure you close it, to make sure you tell your listeners that you've come to the end of the presentation by telling them quite simply, now I've come to the end of my presentation. Or, so that's all I have to say about my experience about homelessness. But before you close, before you leave your listeners, take the time to review what you've said. Repeat your main points. So as I've said, I had a first impression about homelessness, but I changed that impression after reading articles about it. You might emphasize these main points by saying, it's true that many people believe this. Okay. Another way to close is to recommend a future action. When you reviewed the main points, when you've repeated the main points, you've looked back. You've helped your listeners remember what you said. Now you want to invite them to look forward, to think about what they might do next. What can we do now? Or now that we've learned this, where do we move forward from here? For instance, in the example about homelessness, I might say, so what can we do now? Perhaps we can be more sympathetic rather than afraid about people that we see on the streets. A recommendation for a future action. So this final step is the closure. Don't leave your listeners hanging. Tell them that you've come to the end. Review what you've said. Remind them about what you've said so they can remember it. And then invite them to look forward to the next steps. So those are the three main steps for delivering an organized oral presentation. Begin by an introduction. Introduce the what, the why, and give an overview of the main parts. Step 2. Make sure that you've organized the presentation into at least 2, no more than 3 parts. Introduce, guide your listeners through each part with enough examples and details. And finally, don't forget, don't leave your listeners hanging. Close the presentation by looking back, reviewing the main ideas, reminding them of what you've said, and then inviting them to look forward, recommending or suggesting a future step. I hope these 3 steps will enhance your voice recordings moving forward and will improve your oral presentation skills. Thank you for listening.